from the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Good morning, this is David Cline from the History Department at Virginia Tech for the Civil Rights History Project of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture and the Library of Congress. Today we are here in San Diego, California, and this project is being recorded for, as I said, for the Civil Rights History Project. We have with us Guha Shankar of the Library of Congress, and behind the camera is John Bishop of Media Generation and UCLA. Today, we have the great pleasure of being with Mr. Mateo Camarillo, and I will ask you, sir, if you could, just this is the only time that I'll coach you at all today, is if you could introduce yourself in a full sentence. I am, or my name is, and where and when you were born.
My name is Mateo Camarillo. It's a great honor to be a party to this project because that's what America is all about, the contribution of all its elements that make up this great society. I was actually born in Mexico, in Tijuana, which is adjacent, sharing the same ecosystem with San Diego. And I was born the year World War II started, 1941. And so I'm a Mexican citizen by birth. My mother is a U.S. citizen. But during the war, she was involved in the war effort, working at Convair, making planes, B-29 bombers, and working in the tuna factory. San Diego was a large tuna factory, especially in Barrio Logan, located in Barrio Logan. We lived in Tijuana until 1950 when we immigrated. I have a brother and two sisters, and we all immigrated in 1950 and lived in San Diego ever since.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell me just a little bit more about your family background and the role that played in your life as you sort of started to develop a sense of who you were?
My father was a Mexican by birth. He was from northern Mexico, Nuevo León. My mother and her family have roots from Mexico, but they immigrated in the at the beginning of the century, and so my mom, Rufina, was born in Encanto, which is a community in San Diego. And they met in Encanto where she lived. They were actually neighbors. And but my father, moved back to Mexico and Tijuana, and that's why we were born. The four of us, my brother and my two sisters, we moved. We were born in Tijuana, and but my mother grew up in Encanto, and she had two brothers that served in World War II and actually died in fighting for our country, our adopted country. So that's basically, I've being born, and coming to this country. Eventually, after graduating from college, I volunteered to serve in the armed forces because we're involved in the battles in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam and so forth. And I felt obligated to pay back for what I had earned the opportunities to be here. And so I served in the U.S. Army.
So when you first settled in the U.S. as a small child, can you tell me about that process of sort of becoming an American, starting living in the U.S. for the first time, and speaking English, and what the school system was like for a young Spanish speaker at that time?
Sure. Yeah. There didn't exist such a thing as bilingual education. So when we immigrated, I was in the second grade in Tijuana. And so they gave me a test, which obviously was in English, and I failed it miserably because I didn't know English. And all the classes, were, fortunately, it was a very small school, and the grades, there were 2 grades per room. So we would all huddle around and ask in Spanish, what did she say? The teacher, ¿qué dijo? And we'd, among ourselves, try to make sense out of what the teacher was saying. And it was difficult, and because we didn't know English. But most of the students didn't speak English either, because it was a farm labor community made up of immigrants.
So how did you survive? How did you move forward?
It was a struggle. It was a struggle, and we did the best we could. Fortunately, I had a teacher who invited me to have an ice cream with her after school, and then I realized that teachers are actually human beings.
Yeah, hold on. So yeah, just talking about being in the schools as a youngster.
Initially, they thought we were mentally retarded because we couldn't communicate, but we eventually, little by little, we learned a few words and were able to, especially in the playground, where it becomes more natural, to communicate, with English-speaking students, and that's how we learn, just by trial and error, so to speak.
Now, did you confront difficulties from the Anglo students who were there as well?
Initially, but they learned, especially in the playground, that we were actually very good, and so they wanted us on their team, and so that's how we learned to be able to communicate with each other, even though initially, there was some animosity, but we got over it. As we demonstrated, we were human beings just like they were.
Mm-hmm. So, what was the sort of racial geography of San Diego at that time in terms of where people lived? Were things very much, separated or not?
Yes, when we immigrated, my mother, got a job in Mission Valley, which is agricultural. Mm-hmm. Mission Valley is close to the first mission built by Junipero Serra and by the San Diego River. And it was agricultural land and dairy and agricultural. And most of the workers were immigrants. And so the transition, we had a support system, other immigrants. And so we kind of phased in, learning a little bit at a time, through, and I started work at age 10 when we immigrated. And in the work environment also spoke, learned English beyond school. And so that's how we gradually, learned English. Mm-hmm. It wasn't the other way around. English-speaking students didn't learn Spanish. Right. Right. That would have been good, though, because we both would have 2 languages and we could communicate freely. Right.
That would take a long time before anything like that was thought of. Yeah, yeah. How about where you lived, in the neighborhood where you lived? Was an immigrant neighborhood, or were there people who had been here a long time? What was the neighborhood like? The neighborhood where your family eventually lived in San Diego.
Yeah, we immigrated in 1950, and I was 10 years old, and there were, in the Mission Valley area, there were a lot of immigrants because of the labor required in the farming and dairy industries, and so that was sort of a safety net to be able to gradually learn English, and you learn another language by practice. Right. Just like later years, I was stationed in Europe, and I traveled all over Europe and learned languages of other countries where I visited.
Right. So I'm interested in how you defined yourselves when you were young, in terms of, what did you call yourself? Would you use the term Chicano, Mexican, Mexican American? How did your family or those around you talk about who you were?
Well, we were basically identified as Mexican. Others defined us, and we accepted the definition because we were from Mexico, and so we were Mexican, and gradually evolved to Mexican Americans because we were in United States, and so evolved to Mexican American, because we're struggling to become successful participants in this great country. The term Chicano evolved several years later. That was not, actually it was a negative connotation that was more of a slur, but it actually was adopted as a proud term for those that were struggling to gain the same rights as other citizens in this country.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your schooling, at a young age, but then into high school, were you learning about your own people at all? What was the schooling that you were getting here in the California state system? Yeah,
no, there was no information about Mexico or Mexicans. It was independent of schools, where I stayed connected by visiting Tijuana and other cities in Mexico to continue being connected. But we transitioned over time to the larger San Diego community, which is majority English speaking. And the thing that for me made it easier in terms of transition, I was pretty good in sports. And through sports, in the playground, is where I started developing leadership skills, and I was selected in charge of the junior patrols, which is the crossing guards, so that we control traffic, so that other students could cross the street. And so that evolved into plus leadership skills in the playground. And so that actually gave you pride and encouragement that you were just as good as the next person.
Mm-hmm. So if you could just walk me through the chronology of high school and what you did after high school and your service in the Army.
As I mentioned, in elementary school, I was pretty good in the playground, and actually in junior high, there was a coach that wanted to start a team for cross-country runners in junior high, and he asked me to come out and try, and I did, and I was pretty good at it, and I was actually the champion of our grade, in ninth grade when we graduated. And then when I graduated and went to high school, I joined the coach asked me to come out and run for the track team and the cross-country team, and I did, and I led it all years I was there. And so that really was the area where I built self-confidence and eventually evolved to be able to learn English, because I was very active in sports. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I lettered, and when I graduated from high school, I got scholarships.
Okay. Yeah.
Because of my involvement.
Yeah. And so what happened after high school?
Well, as I indicated, I got 2 scholarships. One was from my alma mater, Hoover High School. I got a scholarship. And then a second scholarship I got from the Allied Gardens Women's Club. Allied Gardens was the adjacent community of Granville where I was there. Mm-hmm. And so with those 2 scholarships, I went to college. Nobody in my family had ever gone to college or even graduated from high school. So that was new territory. But I was also the comfort of having, 3 jobs, and so I was occupied, both in sports and in education and in 3 different jobs.
Mm-hmm. So which college did you attend?
San Diego State.
Okay.
Yeah, and I graduated, in 4 years, okay. And that was at the time when the Vietnam War was going on strong. And during while I was in college, President Kennedy was the commencement speaker in 1962. And I had been very interested in President Kennedy. He had actually an outreaching into the Hispanic community. They were called Viva Kennedy clubs. And I got involved in the Viva Kennedy Club in San Diego. And then when he came and gave the very inspirational graduation speech, that even motivated me more to get involved in civic life and various aspects of civic engagement, voter registration, helping others become citizens. I became a citizen at age 21. I was eligible because my mother was a U.S. citizen. I became a naturalized citizen at age 21, where I was eligible to apply. And I applied and I became a citizen. And so I got more, as a citizen, became more involved in the civic life of our communities.
So you talked about Kennedy. Were there other particular moments that started to point you towards involvement?
Well, that was the entry point to getting involved. And then as I was involved in sports, I started getting involved in other aspects of, college life. Although I lived at home, and worked, I still was participating in various, civic activities. And basically through, voter registration, getting more familiar with how government worked, and the partnership between the citizens and our elected representatives. I got more familiar with that process and have been involved in the civic life ever since.
So were there voter registration drives going on in the city at that time?
Yes.
Yeah.
The Viva Kennedy Club was a beginning.
Okay.
And then subsequently, I started a voter registration project in San Diego, connected to the Southwest Council of La Raza, Southwest Voter Registration Project.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, it was the first multicultural voter registration project in San Diego, where we included African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, because many of them, were not participating. They were either not citizens or not involved in the civic life. So we reached out to them to become more broader and more effective, because we're all on the same boat. And we wanted to, we found out that that's a good way to improve our lives and our communities. But we were more successful by including others in similar situations, like Asian Americans, African Americans, and Native Americans.
So about what year was this you were working with that La
This
Raza
is in
project?
1960, from 62, from the Kennedy
Early.
clubs
Yeah,
on.
yeah.
And the reason we got involved with lots of Native Americans, there are 14 Native American tribes in San Diego County. And so they're a very significant element of our communities.
When you graduate from college, is that when you went into the service?
Yes, many of my friends actually left the country. They went to Canada or Mexico because they didn't want to. Vietnam was a very unpopular war, especially with young, college age folks that were eligible to be drafted. There was a mandatory draft, and they didn't want to serve in that. But I felt obligated, to serve, to show, to demonstrate that I was grateful for the opportunities, to participate in our civic life. And I served, I volunteered in the Army, and there was spinal meningitis in California, where the training was. So I was sent to Georgia, and I become more familiar with African Americans, being in Georgia, in South Carolina, and.
So what year is this that you went in?
This is in 65.
Okay, and this was this your first experience of the South, the American South? What did they make of you, Latino
Not much.
from Los Angeles?
Not much.
Or from San Diego? Yeah.
when we finished basic training, we got a 3-day pass to be able. So we went into Charleston, South Carolina, because the closest there, which is on the Atlantic coast, and we enjoyed, just like the Pacific, beautiful. And we were in a restaurant. We were waiting to be served. We waited several hours, and enjoying the views of the ocean, of the Atlantic Ocean, and so forth. And then we finally went looking for the manager and find out what was taking so long to get a meal. And we were informed there was 3 of us on this. Myself, a Mexican American, an African American from Georgia, and a Puerto Rican, because there were a lot of Puerto Ricans in the Army also in the East Coast. So the 3 of us were waiting, and we went. Then I was asked to go check what was going on. I asked for the manager and asked, when I talked to him, I says, we've been waiting several hours, to be served, and when are we going to be served? And he informed me, you're not going to be served. I couldn't believe that. I says, did you run out of food? I says, you're not being served. And that was my first experience in real blatant, discrimination. 3 minorities, Mexican, American, African American, Puerto Rican, couldn't be served. We experienced similar situations in Atlanta. We went to Atlanta one evening. There were nightclubs, so we tried to enter. We couldn't enter. They said we had to have a membership card. We subsequently learned that you buy those on the front door if you're the right ethnic flavor. So that was my experience in the South.
Mm-hmm. Had you experienced any kind of discrimination like that in California? Not at that level. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
No.
So how about in the military itself? How were relations between different ethnic groups?
Well, no, the Army, we're all in it together. No, it was very integrated. A large number of, as I say, African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Puerto Ricans. So, we got along. I mean, because we're in it together, we're on the same side. And so, no, I didn't experience. And also because I was also involved in sports, we developed a track team. We called ourselves the Road Rats. And we, sports breaks across all it's athletic ability. And so, and I was pretty good at it. So, we got along very well. And there was no issue with, the different ethnic groups in the Army because, as I say, we all believe we're on the same side.
Mm-hmm. How about in basic training? Was there
basic
anything
training,
from the sergeants or anything?
No, basic training, one of the things you learn real quick in the Army is you take orders. You're not in a position to argue. So it was the transition in the Army, especially basic training, it was pretty, we were in the learning mode. Right. And so basically, we took orders, and so it was not a challenge or difficult. And although the majority of the officers were Anglo and the majority of the soldiers were minorities.
So when you got
That's a fact of life.
Right.
At that time.
So when you got your orders, where were you sent?
Pardon?
When you got your orders after training, where were you sent?
Yes. Fortunately, most of my peers, fellow soldiers, were sent to Vietnam. I was fortunate. There was too many, what you call green or rookie soldiers dying. So they changed the mixture of who was being sent to Vietnam with experienced soldiers, more experienced, to have better survival rates. I was fortunate to be sent to Europe as an infill for those that were in Europe being sent to Vietnam. So I was sent to Germany. And that was a tremendous experience because I'd never been to Europe. And I was in the armored battalion. I was in infantry in training, but then when I sent to Europe, where they needed the backfill was in the armored division. So I was sent to the 4th Army. I was the training officer for the battalion, the 4th Armored Battalion, and I did my job as a training officer 1 week's work in 1 day. So they needed to find other things for me to do. And the children of soldiers don't have much stimulation or things to do. So most of the Boy Scouts in Europe are dependents, children of soldiers. And they've asked me to lead the Boy Scouts of America in Europe and asked me if I would accept that. I knew nothing about Boy Scouts, but you know, I was willing to learn. And so I was named the Scoutmaster of Europe, the Transatlantic Council in Europe. And fortunately, since I was able to do my job in 1 day for a whole week, I was able to travel all over Europe, taking kids through all the countries in Europe because all the military bases had Boy Scout facilities. We traveled all over Europe. My experience, my 2 years in Europe was very enjoyable because I could do the work very easy and then enjoy, you know, the working with, you know, as a matter of fact, being Scoutmaster and working with children and families is what led me when I got released, when I finished my 2 years and came back. I came back to San Diego, and since I had enjoyed working with families, I joined the welfare department to work with, continue working with families in San Diego as a civilian.
So you're back in San Diego and have been hired by the welfare department. Can you tell me a little bit about that position and the issues that we're facing San Diego and especially Latinos in San Diego at that time?
When I joined the welfare department, I was a rarity. There were very few Spanish-speaking social workers, be Anglo or Mexican or African American. They didn't speak Spanish. And there was a large number of Spanish-speaking families that applied for services, and they pay taxes just like everybody else, but weren't getting services because there was no workers available that were bilingual. So that quickly led me to organizing not only within the welfare department, but with probation and the sheriff's department and other departments, and then outside the county to recruit more people because the need was so. I had English-speaking social workers like me, but spoke only English. They had what's called a caseload, how many families they did, 60. I had 600. Now, that was totally unfair. I mean, I couldn't service them right, and my job was to try to help them become independent so they could be off public assistance. That was my goal, is to have people be independent and self-sufficient, but they had to know how to, apply for a job, where the job market was, and basically counseling, advising them of how they could succeed. But you couldn't do it with 600 families. It was just not doable. So I increased my efforts in recruiting and so I formed an organization, because you can't do it by yourself. So I formed an organization called Trabajadores de la Raza, workers for the people. And other social workers throughout the United States were forming Trabajadores de la Raza chapters. And So we formed a national organization of Trabajadores de la Raza. And we connected with each other to help each other to build more bilingual social workers, be they Hispanic or Anglo, so that the services could be provided to people that needed the services so they could become independent and self-sufficient.
Now, did that organization work within the city organizations or outside or together with? Or?
Well, the San Diego chapter worked in San Diego, San Diego County, all 18 cities in San Diego, not just one city. And we connected with, other chapters, Los Angeles, San Jose, in Texas, San Antonio, Houston, and the East Coast. So we formed a national, and we helped each other, in those various cities, and that's how.
But did you work independently of the
Yes,
the federal or
chapter,
city programs, or
yeah,
did
we
you work
worked
with the welfare
independent within San Diego County.
Okay, but working with the welfare department or outside of the city system?
Well, a large number of the members work within the county because that's who has a responsibility of the municipal governments to provide social services. The city doesn't do it, but we did, connect with, city folks. I mean, we needed, recruits and participants that were bilingual. Right. And, because we did this after hours, we obviously didn't do it as we were getting paid to do our work as social workers, or probation officers or sheriff's deputies.
So it was in addition to. So how did you fund these efforts? Which must have taken a lot of funding. Yes,
we did it through membership dues initially, and then we, I learned. I actually, in college, I learned grant writing, and I was a community organizer and was able to, develop funding through various, sources, foundations, Ford Foundation, government, National Institute of Mental Health, to be able to supplement whatever we could do privately. And one of the initial successful efforts that we did in San Diego is that we met with public officials and demanded that there be more bilingual social work. As a matter of fact, as an incentive to get more bilingual social workers, we were very successful in convincing elected officials, the county board supervisors, for example, to pay a bonus on top of the salary of 10% of the salary as a bonus for those that spoke Spanish, because they were actually doing twice the work because they spoke two languages. And we convinced them of the need and the reward for doing twice the work. And that passed at the county level. With that success, we approached the city and did the same thing and got a bilingual pay bonus for city workers. And then we were the largest employer in San Diego at that time. We're talking about the early 1970s, was the utility, San Diego Gas and Electric Company. And we convinced the board of directors of SDG&E, San Diego Gas and Electric, to pay a bonus and got that instituted. So the three largest employers in San Diego, the city of San Diego, the county of San Diego, and the utility company, SDG, were adopted bilingual pay. And that led me to work with the state legislature with African American and Hispanic. Richard Alatorre from Los Angeles and Mervyn Domley was actually from the Dominican Republic, but was resident in California. And those two, I worked together, and we established a state bilingual pay program in the late 1970s. And so we were able to apply it statewide because it just common sense. And that's how we were able to be very successful. And then those successes led us to other efforts to try to help the underserved communities.
So what were the big issues in the 70s that you were dealing with and trying to address? The major issues?
The major issues is being treated equally. And the manifestation of how unfairness occurred was pretty obvious. The lack of services, for example, in the language that people understood, and try to develop, bilingual programs so that there could be a transition in terms of Spanish speakers. And so we worked on all those fronts. And it took a while. For example, the grand jury, the county of San Diego, they change every year, who the jurors are. One year, the grand jury investigated and came up with the conclusion that bilingual education, as we were starting it, was un-American. And that so angered, Spanish speakers that here we're trying to, through bilingual education, be able to participate. And they're talking as un-American because we're trying to learn English using bilingual education. So we formed an ad hoc committee of 15 different organizations and demanded that the grand jury be abolished or the jurors be replaced. Because how could we be un-American by trying to participate in America by the language, bilingual is a transition to English. And so we faced different struggles over time, but, eventually, we were successful.
How about other issues? So you talked about education. What about employment, housing, healthcare? Were these all issues that were facing folks in the 70s?
Especially employment. I mean, that's basic, and which affects the other issues of affordability of health or, as a matter of fact, we expanded. I mentioned about bilingual services. The other is that there were no food programs for those that were either homeless or low income that couldn't make ends meet, and so we eventually convinced the Board of Supervisors through Trabajadores de la Raza to adopt a food program. San Diego County, of the 58 counties in California, was the only one that did not have a food program. And so we convinced them to adopt a food program, starting with the poorest neighborhood in San Diego County, San Isidro, right on the border between San Diego and Mexico, and Tijuana. And so we were successful through the San Isidro Women's Club and others to convince the Board of Supervisors to adopt, a food program. And that was the beginning of, broader services available to Spanish speakers. And then we did the same thing in the labor force in terms of trying to open up jobs we actually had to sue the county of San Diego. I was selected the executive director of the Chicano Federation, which is an umbrella organization for Spanish-speaking organizations in San Diego. And as the executive director, when, obviously it made the papers and people, a constant stream of employees came to me, to my office, asking for help because they were facing so much discrimination in the job market. And the biggest group were county employees. And so, I basically took their information, and having been a county employee, I was very familiar with, county government and county employment. And I informed them that we'd have to take legal action. However, risk the possibility of losing their job if, there was litigation involved. And so I had to inform them that that was a possibility. But yet they wanted justice, and they wanted to go forward. At that time, this is 1974. At that time, there were 6 Latino attorneys in town. So I notified all 6 to meet at our office, because I had so many cases that demanded fairness, and I shared with them the information because I had permission to do that, and I let them know that, as I indicated, that if we move forward with litigation, that they could lose their job. They agreed to go forward. We went forward, and through the civil rights had passed, equal opportunity employment became federal law, and under those laws, we sued the county of San Diego. It took a long time to get justice. As a matter of fact, it was the longest lasting civil rights case in the history of the United States. But we won and opened up the opportunities at the county, which set the example where we could do the same at the city and the SDG&E and other in the private sector. And that's how we did in terms of increasing employment opportunities.
Longest lasting in terms of the lawsuit?
I'm sorry?
You said the longest lasting case in terms of the suit?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Because it was so complicated. We actually added other groups because they came to us. African Americans came to us. We added African Americans. Asian Americans came to us. We added Asian Americans, Filipinos. So we had Mexican Americans, African Americans, Filipinos, Asian Americans, all the minority groups in San Diego County under our case. And that's why it took a long time, because it was complicated. It included all the groups, but we won.
And what did you win? What changed?
The county, the employers, starting with the county, had to employ minorities. At the time, before we won, before the case was filed, 67% of all Hispanics that applied for employment were turned down. We won the right to have opportunities for people applying for jobs. 67, how could 67% of applicants be ineligible? So there were artificial barriers that had to come down. That's what we want, removal of barriers and equal opportunity. That's what we want. And people got jobs.
Right.
That's what we want. And we went beyond the county. We also did that with the city and private sector. And it only was possible because we had such a broad base, broad support. No one can do that by themselves, or even just one single group. I mean, we're all part of the same family. We're all part of the same situation and experiencing the same kinds of discrimination, if you will, or lack of opportunity. But jobs are important and basic to the actual survival, and people deserve a right to work if they're qualified. And they were.
Right, absolutely.
And so that was very, very rewarding to be able to succeed like that.
Fantastic. So I was going to ask, because we were already talking about this with the case and the coalitions, right, with other groups. Can you talk more about the need for that and what other coalitions you created at that time?
Yeah, another example of, working with others, when President Nixon was running for re-election, he promoted a program called General Revenue Sharing, which was providing funds to cities and counties with no strings attached. They could do whatever with those funds, general revenue sharing. Well, we, we're grateful that was, however, we were concerned since local government, city and county, were not very flexible in terms of serving all the populations, especially underserved communities. So we formed a coalition led by the Chicano Federation when I was the executive director. And the chairman of the board, Dr. Alfredo Velasco, and there was an Anglo coalition umbrella organization like the Chicano Federation that had multiple service delivery organizations under it. We teamed up, the Community Congress, which is primarily Anglo, and that was the time of the hippie movement, of the beach community, and young disenfranchised Anglos. So we had a lot in common. And so we joined forces and we traveled to Washington. The leaders of the two coalitions went to Washington to find out more about the intent of Congress and how it was supposed to work. And it was basically to serve low-income communities. But that's not the way it was going to be implemented based on what we already knew. And initially started out, the city wanted to fund its own pet projects, including units of the city, of the government. And we argued that was not the intent of Congress. It was to eliminate poverty and discrimination. So we got all the social service agencies in San Diego, Family Service, Catholic Services, Social Services, the city and county services, and the agencies funded, as well as United Way as a private agencies, and formed a little army of citizens, and challenged the city and the county, the governments that were using it internally. That's not the intent of Congress. And they tried to redefine, who would be eligible, who was a senior citizen, who was poor. Those were already defined in federal law. The Older Americans Act defined who was a senior. The War on Poverty defined who was poor or low income. So we challenged them, and they wouldn't accept that. So we sued them and won. And basically they had to walk a straight line. And we were able to get the first year a little over $5 million for the community organizations bypassing local government. And the next year we got a little over $6 million. So that working together was a great experience in terms of being able to provide for the needs of low-income seniors and so forth that was not government controlled or defined by government as to who's poor and who's a senior. That's already defined at the federal level. And so we won those battles. And it was very rewarding because that led to other battles to be able to provide for the needs of the underserved.
Now, were you aware or in touch with other Latino organizations around here, but maybe in Los Angeles or in other places as well? I'm just curious what, in terms of the Chicano or Latino communities, what kinds of ways you were involved with one another?
Yes. As I mentioned, we formed Trabajadores de la Raza in San Diego, and there were other chapters are being developed in other cities, Los Angeles, San Jose, Houston, New York, Denver. And so we connected, we kept communication with the other chapters, and we're able to each share, and we learn from each other. And that encouraged us to move on. And the strongest group was the Spanish-speaking organizations, because that was the largest ethnic group at that time, and still is, even more so. And the concept Chicano became more in common use.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, when I left the faculty at San Diego State, I joined the staff of the Chicano Federation, which is the first Spanish-speaking organization in San Diego County that was multidisciplinary and included all organizations, Spanish-speaking organizations in San Diego. And I was the executive director of the Chicano Federation. And through that organization, as well as through Trabajadores de la Raza, I was an officer of that. We connected with other organizations and other in the different cities, and we worked together. As a matter of fact, the strongest chapter, in addition to San Diego, was San Jose, Santa Clara County. And they were working through education and to try to start a school of social work to prepare bilingual social workers. And they recruited me to join the faculty to start the School of Social Work at San Jose. So not only was I in communication, I was recruited, and I joined the faculty at San Jose State because of Trabajadores de la Raza. They asked me, to help them start the School of Social Work.
Wow. So when were you at San Diego State, and when were you at San Jose?
When I got out of the Army, as I say, I was eligible for the GI educational Bill of Rights to be able to get, 2 years of further education. And so I went to San Diego State on the GI Bill to get a master's degree. But during that time, I was working at the county. So I was, I've always did multiple jobs at the same time. And while I was a student in the School of Social Work getting my master's degree, that's when I was working for the county and developing Trabajadores de la Raza and so forth. When I graduated with a master's degree in social work and community organizing was my specialty, I even trained with Saul Alinsky, who was the greatest organizer in terms of, he trained Cesar Chavez, he trained Barack Obama, he trained the founders of the National Council de la Raza. And so I applied for a Ford Foundation fellowship to go to Chicago to train under Saul Alinsky and in community organizing, and joined the faculty at San Jose to train organizers. And so that was, I left San Diego State when I graduated and went to San Jose to be the second in command as the coordinator for field instruction, which is 50% of the time of students in graduate school in schools of social work, and had a pleasant 2-year experience of getting that school off the ground and seeing, the next generation of young leaders, coming out of graduate schools. At that time, there were very few, trained social workers with a master's degree in the whole country. And so that experience was and I recruited to join on the faculty one of the founders of the National Council de la Raza, Herman Gallegos, who was originally from San Francisco. Well, he was born in San Jose, in Santa Clara, in the largest barrio in California, Sal Si Puedes, where Cesar Chavez, they grew up together, Cesar Chavez and Herman Gallegos. And I asked Herman to join me on the faculty, which he did, after he had founded the National Council de la Raza. And Herman, I recruited him because he had worked with many foundations, the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and he knew about accessing capital, especially in the private sector. And as a new school, we needed more than just state funding. So, that was the other reason, because he was a good organizer, and we needed some help in identifying sources of funding to be able to do what we wanted to do, because the state wouldn't fund what we were trying to do as a normal course of things. And so we were very successful because of the team that we put together, including Herman Gallegos.
I wanted to ask, slightly related, maybe a little bit different, about, but again with other groups that you may have worked with, and there obviously there's different approaches in activism, sort of along a spectrum from radical revolutionary to all the way across to sort of working within the system. And I'm wondering if you worked with other groups that had different approaches and how that went. And I know I'm thinking of the Brown Berets, who started in California. Did you work with labor unions? Did you ever have, conflicts or good working relations with groups that had a slightly different approach? Some who wanted revolution now, for example. Or I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yes. Actually, all of the above. When I was the executive director of the Chicano Federation, we were countywide, and we worked with all those groups. As a matter of fact, my offices were under the Coronado Bridge, and we worked with grassroots in Barrio Logan, led by my sister, Tomasa Camarillo, who was elected chairman of an organization called Chicano Park Steering Committee. And they were headquartered in Barrio Logan. And they actually were promised, the community, Hispanic community, Spanish-speaking community, was promised by the city that there'd be a park under the bridge. Well, it turned out that that promise, they were reneging, and they were going to put a highway patrol station, because it's state land under the bridge. The bridge is state funded, and so the landowner was state, and they're going to put a highway patrol. To us, highway patrol, police department, sheriff, they're police, and not very friendly in various ways. And I'll give you a couple of examples. But at that point, they physically, led by my sister, took over the land under the bridge and occupied it. And with picks and shovels, developed a park, Chicano Park. There was no Parks and Rec department or any city involvement. So we physically, led by my sister, Tomasa, who's still the president of Chicano Park Steering Committee to this day. And many of the members of Chicano were artists. And they saw this great surfaces, the pillars, and they decided, hey, we're going to beautify these raw cement pillars. That was the birth of the muralist movement. And you now drive and you see all the pillars decorated with murals, which is the history of the Chicano movement. My offices, when I was director of Chicano Park, were right there under the bridge. It was a built with federal funds, and rather than having a highway patrol, we had this facility with federal funds, and we housed multiple social services, welfare rides, Brown Berets, Pinto Union. Pinto in Spanish are ex-cons. The various, we had, and we recruited government agencies and private agencies like Human Resources from the state of California to have an office there for employment, information on jobs and counseling. We had the welfare department provide social workers, and we had social services provided. And we did a demonstration project how social service ought to be dealt in a more humane and multicultural way. And so we did that with mental health also, because the mental health approaches, as people are crazy or have a deficit mental health, that's not the way to approach mental. We did a demonstration project of how it should be done. And as I said, we housed all various government, private, and volunteer organizations, such as the Pinto Union, such as the Brown Berets. Those are all private. And we all got along because we were in the same boat. We just had different ways of doing it. But we helped each other. For example, one of the first persons to visit me when I was selected executive director of the Chicano Federation was the changed police chiefs. And it was Bill Colander was selected, and I testified in the selection in support because he was a good human being. He was Jewish by background, but he knew of the experience of discrimination. And as soon as I was selected, he called me and he wanted to meet. And so I met with him, and we agreed we would meet on a regular basis. We exchanged phone numbers, and we had direct contact. Didn't have to go through intermediaries or whatever. So we could solve problems directly. And just a couple of examples. One of them is hot pursuit. Hot pursuit, the police would run into our building, which had welfare rights, women, senior citizens, women, various services to the people. And you can't have police running through your building when they're trying to provide services to people. That just scares the heck out of people. And I picked up the phone and told the chief of police that was unacceptable. Without riots, without any bullying, that ceased. Why? Because we went to lunch and we agreed that we'd meet regularly and we have access to each other via phone. The same thing happened with the mayor. The mayor at that time was Pete Wilson. We met, exchanged phone numbers, and agreed to pick up the phone whenever we wanted to talk, and we'd meet every 3 months on a regular basis. Those kinds of lines of communication help. That's why you didn't find riots in San Diego like you had in Watts, LA, or Detroit, various other cities throughout the country. In my opinion, is because we could pick up the phone and talk to people that could solve if you had a dispute or a quarrel. Another example is one Sunday evening, the police department has different divisions, and the northern division, which covers La Jolla and the more affluent communities in the north, 2 officers that finish their shift at 2 a.m. in the morning decided that Sunday that they would have some fun after the shift. They put on black gloves, went to Barrio Logan. And Barrio Logan was the headquarters 2 blocks from my office. The largest lowrider car club in San Diego, Brown Image. Brown Image members came to my office that morning, the Monday morning, to let me know what had happened at 2 a.m. at their headquarters. The police came and saw the lights that were working on their cars, them and their girlfriends. They had their headquarters there on Logan Avenue. And the police decided to beat the heck out of, and they did, not only the men, but the women. And they were so angry, they came to me and they says, there's gonna be hell to pay. This is what happened. I immediately got on the phone, called the mayor, Pete Wilson, the chief of police, Bill Colander. I says, you better get your ass down here before 5 o'clock. There's going to be a meeting with Brown Image. This is what happened. And your presence is required by 5 o'clock. 5 o'clock, we had Mayor Pete Wilson, Bill Colner, and the city manager. There were 500 lowriders and their supporters and their friends. And so I says, for them to explain what had happened. Brown image leaders spoke about what had happened. There was no denial from the police department, but they were readily apologizing. The chief of police apologized. It'll never happen again. The mayor, this will never happen again. City manager, we wanted better relations, that wouldn't happen. The fact that we could communicate saved a riot in San Diego. Other very disturbing acts by the police was, this is the high anti-immigrant experience, and we're right next to Tijuana, Mexico. The police had authorized taxi cab drivers to take Mexican-looking folks to immigration. That came to my attention from residents in San Isidro. I called Bill Colner and says, that's unacceptable. Immediately ceased. Those things wouldn't have happened if I couldn't pick up the phone and talk to somebody that could solve the problem. And that's one of the differences of this city's experience versus other cities where there wasn't that kind of communication. So, yes, I did deal with, folks that had different lifestyles and different methods of, getting justice. But we got along because, we could solve problems. And I didn't object to how they did it. I mean, that's none of my business, and they didn't object. As a matter of fact, they supported what I was doing. And so that was a very rewarding experience to be able to solve problems, without violence. And but we got justice.
Why do you think those individuals, you mentioned Mayor Pete Wilson and the police chief, why do you think that they were amenable to talking with you and actually open in a way that many elected officials in other places have not been? Something in the air of San Diego? Or is it...
The largest minority group by far were Hispanics, Latinos, Mexican Americans.
So it's the power of the vote.
And the number is very significant. And they had to pay attention. And the doors were not opening. And when people get frustrated because there aren't opportunities, things could go sideways. And the public officials are not stupid. They may be prejudiced, but they're not stupid. And they would rather have peaceful resolutions, even if it's on their terms, but at least a solution that didn't include violence, because somebody's going to get hurt, and maybe it'll be them. And so that's, I give them a lot of credit for having common sense. And I think that that's really why we were able to solve problems without violence. Now, that is not to say that we wiped away discrimination or differential treatment, but we worked at it. We worked at it through the system, through litigation, through negotiations, through mediation. I mean, that's an avenue that's available, and we try that first. In our case, we were successful and it worked. And
were there times when taking to the streets was necessary as well? In marches or demonstrations, or?
Well, marches, yes.
Yeah,
I mean, I even joined in some of those marches. Cesar Chavez, came to San Diego, and I met with him and so forth, and we joined the boycott. And that was marches in the streets and grocery stores, and so yeah, you do demonstrations like that, but they're nonviolent in terms of attacking private property or private citizens. But yeah, sometimes you have to demonstrate publicly, the wrongs that exist to try to correct them. and bring attention from the broader community. And we feel that the broader community is fair-minded, they just need information of what's going on. And that was, our belief, and that's what we did.
Fantastic. Yeah. Let me ask you, when you were doing this work and as executive director of the Chicano Federation, was that paying you a salary, or were you earning money in other ways? How were you keeping the bills paid for yourself?
Yes, I was paid a salary. We had a staff, and obviously the executive director is the head of the staff, and I hired other people. So I did it by myself, And I had a very supportive board of directors. The federation was unique in that the board of directors were leaders of other organizations, and so the federation that's what it was, a federation of organizations. And so when the federation spoke, it was speaking for all of the Spanish-speaking organizations in the county. And so it was pretty well respected. And we used nonviolent ways, but we also used the political system. We knew how that worked. And we also, in addition to my salary and working with others, we also raised money through a PAC, Political Action Committee, to help elect responsible and responsive public officials. So we participated to try to change the system both externally and internally. And try to enlighten. And I met with all of the public officials, the heading up municipal governments, county board of supervisors. There's 5 supervisors in the county, and there's mayors that serve 4-year terms, and some are reelected, not all of them. So I met with all the mayors since the 70s and the board of supervisors, and we didn't have enough registered voters to elect Hispanics, so we formed advisory commissions and boards for all the elected officials, mayors, board of supervisors, port commission, state assembly members, so that we could be heard. We had input into the public officials, even though we didn't have Latino elected officials. There's only been in the city of San Diego, for example, 2 Latino city council people serving at any one time. And we haven't had any Latinos on the county board of supervisors. So we had to have a different avenue to be able to communicate and influence, good government. And that's what we did through organizations.
Now, how long were you executive director of the Federation?
I was there until 1976 when, after having sued, the city, the state, the county, I'm not a fool. I knew that at some point, the old saying, don't bite the hand that feeds you. Well, we were getting government grants, we were getting private money, but by suing them, that didn't make them very happy. So I knew that that was short-lived if I wanted to continue challenging wrongness, things that were not quite correct, that I had to have my own private source of income. So in 1976, I chose to go into the private sector. And I did research as to, I knew nothing about running a business. What I had experienced is selling newspapers, chewing gum, picking up recycled materials that could be recycled. That was my experience, shining shoes. That was my experience in the private sector. So I had to learn more about how to earn a living, a better living than shining shoes. And the number one industry, as I did my research, was the food industry. And within the food industry, for people like me that knew zero about how to run a business, I decided that franchising was the way to learn, because you're actually implementing a method, a system that already is successful. And the most successful within the food and franchising business was McDonald's. So I focused on McDonald's, even though I knew the founder of Jack in the Box, a friend of mine, Dick Silverman. As a matter of fact, I have a picture with him, where he stole my hat and he's wearing it and I'm making fun of him stealing my hat. So we were friends, but that was a regional chain, small chain, nothing compared to McDonald's. So I decided to apply for a franchise for McDonald's. They turned me down twice, said I wasn't qualified. I wasn't agreeable in accepting their turn down. I visited existing franchisees and I looked and says, I can do a better job than they're doing. Why am I not? So the third time I asked the regional manager of McDonald's for a meeting, and I said, I'm bringing some guests. I invited the U.S. congressman from this area, the city councilman from this area, board of supervisors from this area, state assemblymen from this area, basically the elected officials who I knew because I've been dealing with them, to this meeting with the regional manager, knowing that restaurants need over a dozen government permits, sound for the drive-through, signage, lighting, size, parking, health, over a dozen different requirements interfacing with government. So who better to have than representatives of the people that even McDonald's has to deal with? And at the start of the meeting, the general manager's name is Dean Canterbury. I says, Dean, before we start, I'd like to introduce the people around here so that you know who you're talking to. So I went by each public official representing. He about fell out of his chair. And so says, we just have one simple question. Could you explain to these good folks why I'm not qualified to be a McDonald's franchisee? Who said you're not qualified? You start tomorrow. That's how I got into business. The rest is history. From there, I branched off. I got applied for radio stations. I owned half a dozen radio stations. I owned other restaurants. I started other businesses, Aztec Nut and Bolt, marketing, promotional companies. I've been incorporated over a dozen nonprofits and over a dozen for-profit. So, basically, to be versatile is you don't put all your eggs in one basket. And so I got involved, but the initial start in business was as a McDonald's franchisee. As a matter of fact, but I continued my civic involvement. As a matter of fact, I had more leverage and more influence. The Secretary of State for the state of California came to me, Marge Fong Yu. She wanted to do a statewide voter registration project and asked me and she wanted to have the private sector participate. I agreed with the Secretary of State, to offer free franchise and talk to my fellow franchisees, other franchisees to participate. And so we gave free franchise to people that showed that they had voted, and with that little button. And I subsequently, by people that were sore losers, accused of trying to influence elections, and which is illegal, obviously, I was rewarding people for voting I didn't tell them how to vote. That's not my job. My job was to try to increase voter participation, and that's what I did. And so I had to defend myself, but it was very rewarding to be able to get in a statewide project with the government, with the Secretary of State, to get more people registered to vote. And that's one of the things that is a barrier for participation of underserved communities, Hispanics, African Americans, Asians, immigrants also, basically they're not all that familiar and don't have the experience in their home countries. And so, this country is great it does have those opportunities, but information doesn't flow very easily. And so that was my job, is to get people informed and get them to participate. And it's still a job. We got a ways to go.
I'll ask more about that, but can you tell me about the radio stations, their bilingual radio stations? Can you tell me about what got you involved and the power of radio? And
the reason I wanted to own radio stations is because information is freedom. The ability to communicate with the people that are impacted by governmental and private decisions is through information, which is not readily available. In San Diego, there were no Spanish language stations to inform Spanish speakers. Those few signals that reached San Diego were from Mexico, from Tijuana. Tijuana is not interested in informing residents of San Diego about city council meetings, school board meetings, information about San Diego. There were a couple also signals from Los Angeles, but that information is about Los Angeles. So you have Spanish-speaking populations not knowing what was going on. There were no Spanish language newspapers. There were small community, 2 or 3 Spanish, but they were small and limited in terms of getting the word out. There's nothing like real-time information rather than history that happened last week. So that's why I wanted to own a radio station, to be able to provide information real-time, because information is power. You cannot remain in the closet or ignorant without knowing what opportunities exist and how to get yourself informed to take advantage of opportunities. So that's the reason I wanted to start a radio station. And having learned about how to do businesses through McDonald's, and McDonald's is one of the biggest users of radio and television. Through every franchisee is required by franchise agreement to spend 4% of all gross income for advertising, radio and television and so forth. So I knew, both as a user and a buyer, about the radio station business. So I applied in 1980. Ronald Reagan was president, and they under his orders, they deregulated the airwaves, the frequencies that were available. For example, Ronald Reagan was a sports announcer for the Chicago Cubs in Des Moines, Iowa, for station 1040. There was only one station in the whole country at 1040. There was no way that a signal at 1040 could reach the West Coast. There was no 1040 on the West Coast. Deregulation meant that there was a 1040 signal available on the West Coast. I applied for it, as did a whole bunch of other people. So I was competing with people from San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, but I won because I was committed and dedicated. I formed a company, a team, multicultural, Quetzal Bilingual Communications. And the purpose of Quetzal is because that's Aztec, our roots. And it's the bird. what better way to demonstrate going over the air as a bird? Quetzal. Quetzal and Bilingual Communications. That was the company that we formed. And it took over 10 years, of struggling, fighting off other competitors and other applicants. But we prevailed. It took a lot of money and it took a lot of time. But once we got that one, and I, with other partners, was able to leverage and go up the state in California, half a dozen in other cities in California to form radio stations, formed other companies to be able to do that. And we connected them by satellite so that we could, by economy of scale, enjoy better success. But we were able to, we'll give you one example. In Barrio Logan, there's a lot of pollution because of the bay, and there was no community planning group to have regulations about what toxic, there were junkyards next to houses, rodents infested, polluting companies, the tuna factory, Monsanto, who harvested seaweed, and a byproduct was toxic gas, all of that. And the Port Commission, which controls the tidelands on the bay, and Barrio Logan's right on the bay, would call me to ask that we run public service announcements when they were going to be releasing toxic gases that would float over Barrio Logan. So obviously as a public service, I did that, and unfortunately, it was to prevent a negative, but the positive was getting information out that was non-commercial. I mean, we didn't get paid for public service announcements. We did it because it was a service. And we started the station, the company, because we wanted to serve. And fortunately, we were able to make money to be able to succeed and continue. But I've dedicated my life to public service, even in the private sector. As I told you, the voter registration, I didn't get paid to do voter registration or give away product like French fries. I did it because it was a public service. I mean, I believe it. That's, I was fortunate that I'd be able to do that because that's really what helped me along, is others extending a hand and letting, helping out. So I truly believe that. That's what America is about, is trying to help your fellow man. And if you can help, why not? I mean, how many dollars can you spend? How many meals can you eat? How many houses can you live in? How many cars can you drive? I mean, you got to help your fellow brother to the extent that you can. And that's what I've done all my life. And that's what I'm about.
And what I hear you saying, what I've picked up on in our conversation, is this love for what is possible here, but also a need to apply pressure to keep that possibility open for others. Did I get that about right?
That's correct. And you see it in various ways. As I mentioned, in terms of, elected officials that are supposed to represent the people, well, they represent the voters that vote. And we needed to change that. We needed to influence public officials by common sense approaches of showing them where discrepancies exist in terms of, public services, public access, public policy. That wasn't fair because it wasn't representing. They were just representing people that voted. I mean, but there were other people that needed, their attention and their services, and public laws like bilingual education, like bilingual pay, things that people that voted for them were not going to be advocating. So we learned, it took pressure. And some of that pressure also was, softened by raising money, like through political action committees, to add a little bit of sugar to the conversation. When I was with McDonald's, I organized with other McDonald's franchisees a political action committee. It's called MacPac, to influence or to raise money to contribute. I met with, governors of the state of California, contributed significantly to the campaign of Jerry Brown when he first ran in the 70s, Gray Davis, Cruz Bustamante, and so forth. Jerry Brown, whenever there was a judicial position open, the reason they called me is because I contributed through the Golden 500. Privately, outside of McDonald's, we also had Hispanic-based Golden, and we had chapters throughout San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Sacramento, etc. And we taxed ourselves. As a matter of fact, the membership was $500, and we raised other monies, and we contributed. For example, to the first one when we started, Jerry Brown was running for governor, and he was dating a Hispanic, as a matter of fact, Linda Ronstadt, and so he was sympathetic, but we influenced it a little bit more, and so when he got elected, and there was a judicial opening in San Diego, I'd get a phone call. And once it was opening for 6 judges, and he says, "Do you have any recommendations?" I nominated all 6 judges, all lawyers in San Diego, Hispanic, and they all got appointed judges, 6, all at one time, because there was, and others. He appointed me to a board that dealt with the retirement money, pension funds. And so we made recommendations on how that should be more adequately distributed, as it's earning returns until people have to use it when they retire. And so we're involved, it's a two-way street. You help them and they help you. But you get more attention when they feel that you contributed to them getting elected. And it's been that way not only with the governor. I did it with Pete Wilson, who was actually hostile to Hispanics when he was governor of California with the anti-immigrant resolution. And ever since that, over 20 years ago, there has not been a Republican elected officer in the state of California run statewide, be it governor, be it senator. There hasn't been one Republican, with the exception of one, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was a movie star, well known, and he employed his nanny, who was a Mexican, so he employed Hispanics. Of course, there were. The point is, he was very that hostility remains to this day. And it's unfortunate for the Republicans that they're taking such a beating in California. But you have to be responsive to the electorate.
Mm-hmm. So has the number of Hispanic registered voters gone up in the time that you've been working on these issues?
I'm pleased to say yes. However, we got a long ways to go. We have a long ways to go. It's because, as I say, information doesn't flow very easily. And some people that immigrate from countries where there's dictators and people, the democracy isn't as wide open, or high corruption, that they're not familiar or willing to participate because they see the cards stacked against them. They don't participate. And so it takes a little bit of, re-education, so to speak, of what the democratic process is all about. Because although they're democratic societies they came from, they're not really in practice, that democratic.
Mm-hmm. Have the public schools changed in terms of educating Latinos since you were a child here in San Diego?
Definitely. Not to the extent they ought to. As you can see by the evidence, over 50% of Hispanics entering public school are Hispanic. Yet the graduation rate is horrific. Why is that? It's still got a ways to go. It's changed, yes. There is such a thing as bilingual education, which at least provides a starting point where they could start learning, as in transition, from their native language to English. But it takes time. Language is not that easy for some folks. And there's also in California a movement to have multicultural curriculum so that they're learning about different cultures, especially their own. The Southwest was Mexican for years, centuries. Reminds me of a story that when I was in Europe and heard all the different languages spoken in the same country, multi-languages, it surprises me that there's a debate that English should be the only language, the official language, while other countries they're enriched by being multilingual, multicultural. And it's a struggle to have it here. And the sign of an educated person is knowing about other cultures, other languages. When I was going to college, I studied about, I was fortunate to have great teachers. And my art teacher, for example, was an expert on the Aztecs, the Mayas, the Toltecas, the Chichimecas, and their art and culture. And so I named companies after Aztec leaders. Quetzal is the god, one of the gods of the Aztecs. Quinto Sol, the fifth sun, is the world we're in today. I named one of my companies. Aztlan. Aztlan is the southwest part where the Aztecs originated, and they migrated until they got to Mexico City. I named companies Aztec nut and bolt. And people ask me why. And I says, that's a sign of an educated person. I studied about the Greeks, as many college students take curriculum, study about other cultures. That's a sign of an educated person. Why do you play down and call it racism or discrimination when you promote, other cultures, that deserve respect and recognition? That's a sign of an educated person, not an ignorant or prejudiced person. And so that's why I promoted and keep promoting multiculturalism, because, that's a sign that you understand. We're all connected from. As a matter of fact, you asked about La Raza and Chicanos. During the Mexican Revolution, one of the members of the revolution was an educator, Jose Vasconcelos. Jose Vasconcelos wrote a book right after the war, the Mexican Revolution, called La Raza Cósmica, the cosmic race. Mm-hmm. And that's where the concept La Raza comes from. And one of the first national organizations I was invited to join was the National Council of La Raza, which is the most prominent Latino national organization. And I served the maximum terms. And during that time, I worked with President Ronald Reagan. This was in the 80s. And we worked with Senator Orrin Hatch, Republican, and Senator Ted Kennedy, Democrat, and Reagan's presidential delegates in the National Council of La Raza board and staff to develop immigration reform. And that passed, signed by Ronald Reagan. IRCA was called, Immigration Reform Act. Some people call it amnesty. It was actually a way to pardon and legalize people already here, fully employed and contributing to the building of America. But yet, people say we shouldn't be doing that. We're a country of immigrants. Why not? Let people that are working here, contributing to build their country greater, be able to live here without being scared of being deported. They're already here working, and why not just legalize the situation and acknowledge that that's the fact? And so I've worked that, but I didn't do it by myself. I did it with others because that's how you get things done, is working together. And I'm very proud of having been able to make achievements working with, in the state of California, the most influential multicultural organization is the Green Line Institute. It started on housing, green lining, the opposite of red lining, which is done by insurance companies and real estate industry to limit access to funding to buy a house through banks and lending institutions, to green lining, to be able to do a way of mitigate against redlining. And that organization is led by African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, statewide. And I was the delegate from San Diego to the Green Line Board of Directors and served in that capacity for over 20 years. And we worked on banks, insurance industry, telephone industry, utilities, to open up green line opportunities for underserved populations. And under that role, I was asked by the Public Utilities Commission to chair the deregulation of the telephone industry in California. And I was chairman for that for 10 years. And we developed a citizens board that reported to the Public Utilities Commission, and we provided services in 10 languages for all telephone, wire, and wireless companies in California. And that's an example of doing something with others, multicultural groups in the state of California, to be able to have fairness for underserved populations. That's just one example.
Can you tell us a little bit, too, about your own involvement in electoral politics as an elected official yourself?
My own opinion of the response to immigrants?
Well, no, you ran for office yourself,
yes.
Correct? Could you tell us a little bit about that? And then we will get to that subject.
Yes, I run, the first time I ran for public office was school board, because education is key. And there has never been, or had been, today there is one Hispanic on the school board, one. When I ran, there were none, and there never had been. The reason why is because the electoral system, the process to get elected was district-wide. And that's why we worked to change that system so that you run by districts in neighborhoods, so you're closer to the schools and the communities where the voters are that needed the services of the public officials. But that didn't exist when I ran. I had to run district-wide. The whole district in San Diego Unified covers the whole city. And it was a challenge. But I did win in the primary race to go into the general election. In the general election, my opponent was a nice lady, senior citizen, who had a lot of knowledge of the political. She was the staff of a state assemblyman. So she knew the ins and outs of that, and she had access to the assemblyman that she worked with, and accessed his sources of income.
Right.
So I was outfunded significantly. Yet the school teachers endorsed me. And so it was a close race, but I lost. And I did a post-analysis of the election. It turned out that only 19% of the electorate had children in school. And over 60% were senior citizens that participated in hot lunches at every school. They were more interested in hot lunches than in the education of children. So the school race had nothing to do with education. I wrongly focused on education, trying to open up the school opportunities for all, including those underserved. So that's a novice for you running for a post, thinking it was about education when I missed the boat with the electorate. And that's the unfairness of information in education. It's not evenly distributed so that people are knowledgeable of how the system works.
Right. And did you run for other offices?
A second office I ran was also for education at the community college level, because the majority of underserved, their first, after graduating from high school, their next step is the community college, not a four-year university, because they can't afford it, or they're not, the community colleges are closer to them and more affordable. So I ran for the southernmost community college district that's adjacent to Tijuana. It's called Southwestern Community College. I ran for that office. And before I decided to run, I pulled together Latino leaders throughout the area, and they unanimously said they would support me. So I decided that I'd run because I had a base. They would support me, and the majority of the ethnic groups were Hispanic, obviously in the South Bay next to Tijuana. Unfortunately, one of the professors got into some hot water in the district, and he convinced his brother to run so that he would have a relative to defend him when he because he was getting into trouble. This was after the promise of all the leaders that they would support me. Well, the end result was that we had two Hispanics running and an Anglo, very wealthy, from Coronado. The district also, that's called gerrymandering, included the wealthy Anglos from Coronado, one of the wealthiest communities in San Diego. That was part of the district. And I was outspent again. And, she was elected official from Coronado. So it was a close race. And the most voters voted for Hispanic, but there were two Hispanics.
So it's split. Yeah.
And so I came in second. That was my second experience. And the last time I ran was for city council. I've been involved in redistricting. It's done every 10 years after the census count. Right. The enumeration changes districts because they come unbalanced through 10 years of growth. Their growth is not even, it's very uneven. And so you have to redraw lines to comply with the US Constitution of one man, one vote. It's really one person, not one man, but one person, one vote. And you redistribute, so you draw lines. And I've been involved since 1980 in redistricting. My first effort was redrawing the lines for the state of California, for state assembly and state. 10 years later, I was asked by the county chief administrative officer to help him redraw the county lines. So I served on the county redistricting. The next time, there was a change of method of how people got selected to be on to make it less partisan or political. The state, San Diego chose to have judges select commissioners to draw the lines. I was honored to be selected by judges to be redistricting the city of San Diego lines. The most recent was the 2010 census, and the city again had to redraw lines. The citizens, the Latino residents of San Diego were being left out. And they created a Latino redistricting committee to shadow the work done by people appointed by the government. And I was selected the chairman of the Latino redistricting committee. So we influenced the drawing and created, for the first time, a district that was majority Latino. Latino residents, not voters. But it was Latino. And they've asked me to run. So I ran for the last time for city council of the newly created 9th district. It was a new district because of the population growth in San Diego. And it was a Latino majority district, the 9th district. And the voter turnout was less than 10%. Of those that could vote, less than 10% turned out to vote. Who ran against me? An incumbent city council person from another district that moved to the 9th district to Anglo. Former newscaster, obviously well known because appeared in the television every day as a newscaster. Well known. Nice lady. And with so few people voting, they went with name ID, a person that was already an incumbent, who was on their television sets every day. And so I gave it my best shot, and that's the last time I ran.
So what are you working on now?
My wife and I, we own a business. And it has, beyond, for being for profit, it also has a social benefit to help, people that have difficulties. In California, when somebody gets a driving under the influence, when they get a citation, a ticket for driving under the influence, especially if it's the second one, they're required to put a breathalyzer in their car. That's what we do. We install breathalyzers in cars of people that have been cited for driving under the influence. And they're with us as a customer until they serve their term. And the length of time they're on depends on their situation. The blood alcohol when they got it, did they hurt anybody? Did they do damage? All the circumstances that could happen affect how long they're with us as a customer. But we see quite a few graduate, because we've been at it for half a dozen years. And we represent the best manufacturer in the country. They've been at it since, it's a German company that's been at it since World War I. As you know, gas was used in World War I. So they're experts in gas. As a matter of fact, they're the number one suppliers of gas in hospitals worldwide. And they make those machines because they're based on activation of gas, breathalyzers. And so we're providing a service, and yet we're, make a living. Yeah. We're still, my wife and I, she's also a businesswoman, and she's the one that actually forced me to write the book, my autobiography, Journey in Search of the American Dream, because of her. She says, you got to do it. I had a garage full of files, and, what are you going to do with what's all this? All the walls with plaques and awards, and it's just, you got to write a book about it. So I did. With the help of the National Council La Raza, their permission to use, and been on the board, and a lot of the activities that I did was with the founders of the National Council as well as members, when I was serving for, the maximum of 2 terms. And I've done that with organizations. I've never done anything by myself that's meaningful. It's always with others, and especially similar situated, underserved populations. That's what I'm about.
Okay. So maybe a last question. When we talked a little bit before, you were talking about immigration reform under Reagan. Can you talk a little bit about where we are now and your thoughts on especially immigration issues?
Well, the United States, although it's a country of immigrants, the only natives are the Native Americans, and the Pilgrims were immigrants. As a matter of fact, the Spanish were here over 100 years before the Pilgrims arrived. And other immigrants from other countries all over the world have come to this country. We're a country of immigrants, and we're proud out of it. As a matter of fact, our Constitution, spells out that we're all equal under the law, and we all participate. As a matter of fact, the French donated a statue welcoming immigrants to this country, whether they be Irish from escaping the potato famine, be they Italians, be they Irish, be they from South and Central America, be they from Asia. We're a country of immigrants. That's our history. And that's what makes this country great. However, it's also a dynamic issue. And things have changed over the years, whereby it was open borders and welcoming everybody, to being a little bit concerned that maybe they're taking jobs away. And nobody paid attention to the jobs they took or they got were jobs that people didn't want. My first wife is from Oregon. The few workers that were available to work in the Willamette Valley and the farms were immigrants from Mexico. Yet there were not enough immigrants. You had strawberries rotting in the fields because there were not enough. As a matter of fact, the schools closed early so the children could go out in the fields and pick strawberries so they wouldn't be rotting in the fields. People don't realize that they're creating jobs. Immigrants are creating jobs. They just think, sure, that over 80% of the farm work in California is done by immigrants. The Reform Act that we did is to pardon those that are already here. I agree that there should be a regulated process so as to how people come here and so forth. But because we are immigrants. As a matter of fact, research has shown that immigrants contribute billions of dollars to our economy and have invented developments in our high-tech world and contributed significantly. But yet there persists this concerned that they're taking jobs, and now more recently, since we got involved in wars in the Middle East, that there are people that have hostile feelings are coming here with that hostility from countries, from Iran, Iraq, other Saudi Arabia, other countries that may not have friendly intentions. That dimension adds to the mix of sentiment about immigrants. As a matter of fact, one candidate that's running for president is talking about building walls and deporting, and it's a debate. It's an ongoing, fluctuating debate. But my opinion is that we're a country of immigrants. Yes, it makes sense that we should have a regulated process so that it's controlled to the extent that it's absorbed as it's needed by our economy, by our communities. But we don't, put walls. That's not the reasonable, sensible way to approach this. But yes, we should have, some kind of regulated process that we all have a voice to say about having a sane policy on how we manage that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So winding up here, any questions that I should have asked you today, or that you thought I might ask you that I didn't, or anything I should have asked you?
Well, I'm honored and pleased that you've taken the time to talk to me and about sharing my experiences in terms of what the intent of Congress was, in terms of sharing the contributions of folks with different backgrounds that are been ignored over the years. What I like to learn a little bit more about, the end product in terms of the distribution of that and how, we can make it more accessible to because as I said before, education is really what opens the eyes, opens the minds of folks that, don't have a full understanding of our complete society. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to know how we can, get it into the hands of those that need it, mm-hmm. that should get enlightened and be more informed of the contributions other folks that have done that maybe not speak their language or live in their neighborhoods, but are here to mm-hmm. contribute to make this country greater.
I think that's a great point, one we can talk about.
So that's what I'm interested in.
Good.
And that's why I agreed to participate.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.